So, good morning to everybody and welcome again in Brussels for this second day of the conference. And we will have a panel debate this morning about what should we exactly educate about violence throughout the 20th century. Why should we teach about this violence anyhow? And how should we do so in order to educate it effectively, whatever that may mean? So the what, why and how of educating violence in the 20th century in history education and in popular historical culture, these are the three main guiding questions in this panel debate. For this panel debate we have three participants. The first one on my left side is Dr. Hubertus Knabe. He is a German historian and the scientific director of the Berlin Hohenschönhausen Memorial. Do I pronounce that more or less right? Okay, thank you. Which is a museum and memorial in a former Stasi torture prison in Berlin. The aim of the museum and memorial is to research the history of the prison and, of course, the related oppressive regime, and to encourage a critical awareness of the methods and consequences of political persecution and suppression in the communist dictatorship. Colleague Knabe has especially published on oppression in the former communist states of Eastern Europe, particularly in East Germany. Next to Dr. Knabe is Professor Luigi Caiani. He teaches modern history and history didactics at Sapienza University in Rome in Italy. His research interests concern the history of historiography, history didactics, and crime and criminal justice during the Ancien Regime. And then on the outer left side of me, well, for you the right side, is Dr. Lukas Kaminski. He's a Polish historian, and he is specialized in the history of Poland after 1945, particularly the period of Soviet occupation and the Soviet-imposed People's Republic of Poland. He also is the president of the Polish Institute of National Remembrance. Was. Okay, sorry. Since violence is an enormously broad concept, encompassing different shapes, types, scales, and so on, the organizers of this conference have asked us to focus especially on totalitarian violence, both from the left and from the right. Therefore, we are focusing in today's panel on representations of totalitarian violence related to fascist and communist regimes before, during, and after the Second World War, until, let's say, the end of the 1980s with the fall of communism in the former Eastern Europe. I would like to divide the panel debate into two parts. I would first like, with the participants, I would first like them to assess, let's say, current educational practices regarding educating about 20th century totalitarian violence from the left and the right in history education and in popular historical culture. And then I would like to proceed to debate about desired practices. How, in the ideal world, would educating about violence look like, and why should it have that specific outlook? So, a first question that I would like to ask the three participants is, in your country, how is the issue of totalitarian violence in the 20th century from the left and from the right? How is it dealt with in history education and in popular historical culture? Can we speak of a master narrative, a dominant social historical representation from that violence? And also, how would you judge it? Is it in line with historiography? Is it more or less balanced? Are there specific silences? So if you could, in a first round, shortly comment on that so that the audience knows about representations in your country, which we will build upon for the next steps of the debate. I give you, Dr. Knabe, first.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much also for the invitation. I always enjoy very much this international communication with our colleagues in other countries because it widens your own horizon. So I'm also very curious about this discussion now. I was wondering about the title, because education about violence it remembers a little bit of anti-violence training in schools nowadays, because violence is growing up in schools in Germany, and we have special programs to avoid that. But you wished to talk about historical violence, political violence, I guess. And I think we would prefer not to talk about violence, but more about dictatorships and anti-human, totalitarian ideologies, because there are also dictatorships without, or nearly without, physical violence. If you frighten the society enough, then you don't need any violence, or nearly any violence. And it was a little bit the case in East Germany that, at least in the last decades, the physical violence was not very obvious. But if we talk about the historical education in Germany, we have to remember that Germany had two dictatorships, but very different dictatorships. The Nazi dictatorship, in this case, the Germans were the perpetrators and not the victims. And the communist dictatorship, it was caused by the Soviet occupation. So you can say the Germans were victims of the communist dictatorship, as all the other countries in Eastern Europe. And the communist dictatorship was existing only on a very small part of Germany, so only in East Germany, what means around 1/3 of Germany was communist, and that the result of that is that the majority of the Germans don't have any personal experiences with the communist dictatorship. If you talk about the historical education about the Nazi time in Germany, I would say that the level of information is quite good. Although the colleagues in the Nazi concentration camp memorials are not satisfied with the results sometimes, if you make surveys, what young people are knowing about the Nazi time, they're also disappointed, but it's much better than the education of the communist regime. So we have a special day at schools, for example, the day of the liberation of the concentration camp in Auschwitz in January. This is a day where in a lot of schools are certain activities where young people are taking care of this time. It plays a very big role in the curricula at schools. So I would say that if you asked any young people in Germany, do you know Adolf Hitler? They could answer yes, and they could say who he was. Do you know Auschwitz? I would guess they would say yes, I know that was the extermination camp of the Jews. If you ask the same questions about the GDR, you wouldn't get these answers. We have some surveys when young people were asked who was Erich Honecker, and they don't have any idea. They think he's an actor or something like that. Or Erich Mielke, the head of the State Security Ministry. They don't know him. Most of them don't know him. And if you asked about, let's say, a Soviet prisoners camp in East Germany, as they existed in Buchenwald, for example, or in Sachsenhausen, they don't know that normally. So there's a big gap of information level between the two regimes, and that makes, and it's also caused because history plays not a very big role in the education at high school. So we have 1 hour per week. And in this 1 hour per week in history education, the Nazi time is dominating everything. There's also a problem, I think we will talk about this later on, that sometimes young people are a little bit fed up of this historical education of the Nazi time, because they are educated, the Germans were the perpetrators, but they don't feel as perpetrators because it's a long time ago and they are not responsible for that. And they feel sometimes a certain pressure to feel guilty, and they have a kind of anti-reaction. I think we will talk about this later on. And so the result of this gap between the two regimes is that the communist ideology is not known, and that means also that the young people are in a way, how can I put it, you can get them with left ideologies much better than with right-wing ideologies, because the utopia of communism sounds good, especially for young people who are fighting or who have a greater sense of justice, and they think it's a good idea. And so I think the education about the communist ideology is very important, and we have to improve that. But it's difficult, and the second result I want to mention at the end is that the victims of communism, they feel often like second-class victims, because they're always in the shadow of the Nazi victims. And that's a kind of, if you talk about violence, it's a kind of violation of their feelings, because they're not really honored. And we have big memorials in Berlin, for example, and the capital of Germany, for the Holocaust victims, for the Roma and Sinti victims, for the homosexual victims, for the victims of handicapped people who had been killed. But we don't have any monument for the victims of communism. And so they are really frustrated. A lot of them are very frustrated about that. And if you give them a little bit of appreciation, you can make them really happy. And so I think what we are doing, perhaps we are talking about this later on as well, we are using the victims of communism as transmitters in the education of history. So we are working a lot with them. We are sending them in schools. We are making guided tours through the prisons with the former political prisoners. And it's not only very effective, because young people are really moved about that, but it's also kind of honoring, and they feel really good in this role to talk about their experiences in the past. So that's it.
Thank you. And then I would like to ask the same question to Luigi Caiani, who's from Italy. Italy also involved, well, to a certain extent, let's say on the perpetrator side of the Second World War, who did not really have a communist regime, or only very small after the Second World War. So Luigi, how is totalitarian violence represented in Italian history education?
The interesting fact with Italy is that Italy was both the perpetrator and the victim during the Second World War, because Italy started the war on the side of Nazi Germany and ended the war on the side of the Allied after the armistice of September 43. And this gave a very peculiar history to Italy, because in Italy there was no trial like Nuremberg or Tokyo against the Axis powers. So these big trials gave the opportunity to the public opinion to know about the crimes of the previous regimes, what was not the case for Italy. Also because many of the Italian perpetrators of war crimes, both in the Balkans during the Second World War and previously in Ethiopia in the war of 35-36, they were collaborators of the Allied forces. Badoglio, for instance, was responsible for the use of chemical weapons in Ethiopia, was the prime minister after Mussolini, and he collaborated with the United Kingdom and the United States during the last phase of the war. So it was also the logic of the Cold War, because most crimes had been perpetrated by Italians in Yugoslavia, but Yugoslavia was on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain, more or less. And that's why, even if the Yugoslavian regime asked for the surrender of Italian generals as war criminals, Italy could refuse because it was supported by the Allied powers. The same was anyway the case with Germany, because of course Germany and Italy were on the good side of the Iron Curtain, and the US and the UK didn't want that a new ally put to trial members of the military of the other one. So they didn't want that Italy put to trial German military, and just a very few cases.
And does that still affect current representations of this totalitarian violence? This
yes.
legacy of the Cold War representations?
Yes, because it was possible, by the absence of information on Italian war crimes, to invent the myth of the good Italian soldier incapable of cruelties in war against civilians. What is not true, because also Italians perpetrated crimes in the Balkans and in the colonies. But the fact that there were no trials, there was no information at all. And this myth survived for a long time. Now it seems disappeared. And it was debunked and destroyed by the activity of many historians who made research, first of all in Italy, then above all after the end of Yugoslavia, also in Yugoslavia, because many archives were opened and to historical research, both for Italians, Slovenians and Croatians. Slovenians above all were very collaborative. And now in all history textbooks you find a good information, a bit discontinuous, but still a good information on crimes perpetrated by Italians. And what I find very interesting is that the myth of the good Italian, which has been nurtured also by movies, for instance, Capitano Corelli or Italiani Brava Gente, movies diffused not only in Italy but also abroad. Recent socio-psychological research, to which I also participated, starts showing that this myth has disappeared. And if you, at least among the young generation, and if you talk to people, they say that the attitude of Italians, both in the colonies and during the Second World War, was more or less the same than of other powers.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so for Germany we have, at least regarding the Nazi regime, an emphasis on the perpetrator side. Italy was an avoidance of the perpetrator side, but has become more balanced, let's say. And what's the situation in Poland? Does Poland present itself as a victim of totalitarian regimes, or is it stated in another way? So how is totalitarian violence represented in Poland?
So let me explain it in a historical perspective, because I think it's really necessary. We in Poland experienced a serious clash about the past and its representation, about the remembrance in the 1970s and the 1980s. It was, of course, a fight between the communist regime and the opposition. And this, let's say, debate was focused on 20th century and especially on the history of totalitarian violence, because the main topics were Polish-Bolshevik War of 1920, Soviet aggression, Soviet occupation during the Second World War, Soviet crimes, communist crimes in post-war period. And this debate was not only on some kind of political level, so let's say political statement, etc., but it was very vivid in public life, because in independent periodicals you could read a lot of articles about the contemporary history. There were underground books about some parts of history, including special textbooks for students and for teachers. There were independent seminars focused mainly on teaching the truth about the past. There was also a symbolic representation, because in Poland already in 1980s, for example, we had in public places monuments for commemorating victims of communism. In the 1981, there were a few monuments built to the victims of events in Poznan in 1956, December massacre of 1970, and etc. We had a lot of memorial plaques in churches commemorating, for example, victims of crime, massacre, and, for example, on many cemeteries, also in very small towns, you could find in the 1980s special crosses devoted to the victims of the Soviet and communist crimes. So, in the moment of the fall of the system in 1989, in fact, we had a ready model of this master narrative about the totalitarian violence or totalitarian experience. And this model is like this, that we, Poles, experienced two totalitarian regimes, Nazism and communism. We fought with them, we opposed them, so we are the heroes. And of course we suffered a lot from both totalitarian systems, so we are also the victims. So already in this model there is a kind of tension between being a victim and being a hero of resistance. It's changing now, and it was discussed a few times after 1989, and let me show a few examples, but before it I have to stress that this general narrative, this model of remembrance wasn't seriously questioned on the political level. Even during the altogether 8 years of post-communist government, post-communist party was not able to change this view of the past in which they were responsible for serious crimes and using violence against society, etc. A few examples of debates on this model. Of course, the first one, and probably known to everybody in this room, is Jedwabne case in 2001. After the book of Jan Tomasz, written by Jan Tomasz Gross, there was a serious and long-lasting debate in Poland about this model, because the problem with Jedwabne was, is it possible that we were not only the victims, but in some cases also perpetrators of the crimes during the Second World War? And looking after more than 15 years, I think this debate didn't change this general model. This case was in fact incorporated, so when you read the textbooks or popular history articles, you can find, yes, we were the victims. In general, we were the victims of the Second World War, but in some cases some Poles were responsible for also for the crimes. And I think this influence was much more not in the education, but in the popular culture. We had, for example, a movie by Władysław Pasikowski, Pokłosie, Aftermath in English, quite popular, especially abroad, play by Tadeusz Słobodzianek, Nasza klasa, Our Class. So I think this influence was much stronger in the sphere of culture. The second discussion, even current now, is a discussion about so-called curse soldiers, so anti-communist underground during the war, and the problem that this part of the history was not represented enough in public life, in our remembrance, in school education, etc. So now it's a kind of political debate, because ruling party is using this example that this important part of our history and so many victims, tens of thousands of victims, were forgotten also in the Third Republic. So that means that it was a kind of post-communist country, and we need to change a lot in our country. And the last example of ongoing discussion is a case of museums. This discussion around the representation of the totalitarian past in museums started, or violence started in 2004. Then a museum of Warsaw Uprising was erected, and this discussion of course also had a political dimension, because on the one hand it was also a political project, not only educational one, historical one, but also a kind of political project. And then discussion was that there were opinions that after seeing this museum you can have an impression that we won this uprising, and the victims, especially civilians, are forgotten. The second debate was about the Silesian Museum in Katowice, how to describe, also in the context of 20th century and the totalitarian systems, how to describe the specific history of this region of Poland. And the third and ongoing debate is, of course, connected with the Second World War Museum, and there are some serious and I think universal question asked: how to show the history of the Second World War. Was it, were there only the bad sides of the war, or the people who are asking questions that maybe, for example, we should show in which way the war pushed people to be heroes, to oppose the totalitarian powers, etc.
And this, what you said at the end about universal character and representations, this is what immediately, this is what I wanted to add. What strikes me in what you are telling about how totalitarian violence is represented in your countries, it seems to me that it is represented really from a national perspective and not that much from a transnational, European, global, whatever perspective. So in the context of this conference, this is of course an interesting finding that we should certainly further debate later on in this panel. But what I wanted to ask first, just to put things clear, so this very national perspective, this very national approach of totalitarian violence, could you connect that to a certain extent to the main aims of history education in your countries? Because I heard here from a colleague Knabe, well, we should educate young people to have certain values. I hear in your story you use the word our history, so we should emphasize heroes and so on. There I sense some kind of identity politics. In Italy there has been a shift from identity politics, the good Italian, the brava gente, Italian soldiers, towards a more critical stance. So what I would like to ask, and just answer shortly please, to what extent is it connected to the main aims of history education in your country, this specific representation of totalitarian violence? And do you have any idea about the effects of this kind of teaching on young people? I will just give you the example of Flanders. In Flanders, we have something called remembrance education. We teach a lot about totalitarian violence in the 20th century and other forms of violence in order for young people to learn from the past for the present and the future. We want to impose them certain democratic human rights values and so on. That as such should not be a problem, but the problem is we don't have any empirical proof of effects of this teaching on young people's behavior. Even on the contrary, the proof that we have is not always that promising. I also refer to a research of Alexandra Euser in France, and she saw that young people, especially young people with not that much socio-cultural capital, to speak in Bourdieu terms, she says, yeah, well, these young people, they are imposed to learn a lot about the Nazi regime and the Second World War, and what they do is they misuse it to shock white society. So they really are going to say, no, Hitler was a good guy. Not because they mean that, because they know if we say that, we are going to shock everybody, and that's what we want. So you could say it's even a counterproductive way of teaching. So please shortly comment on the main aims and the effects on young people.
Yeah, this is really an important and complicated question. It's a question if you ever can learn of history, to start very generally. We are historians, so we must believe in that. If not, then it wouldn't be worth to work about history. But I think there are also some proofs for the possibility of learning of history. Let's start with young kids who the first time touched a hot oven. They will never do it again because they made this experience, they know it's hot and it's dangerous. And probably if you are able to immunize young people in this way, be cautious if you are confronted with ideologies which are not respecting the rights of the individuals, which are saying that violence of political movements are allowed for some goal and future, and so on. So there are some certain criteria I think you can probably teach young people, and they can hopefully learn about that. And this, of course, you need knowledge to judge something. And for example, in Germany, it's for me always, still now, it is very interesting to study the very beginning of the Nazi regime, because it started in a democratic way. So the Nazis were elected, and Hitler became chancellor, and you can see how it worked, and you see as well a lot of parallels to nowadays existing regimes like Turkey. So you start with ending the independence of the justice, and so on. So certain measures which are still legal. This period is very interesting to learn about, where you really have to pay attention that this doesn't happen again. And if you ask for the effects of this historical education, probably one effect could be that nearly 4 or 6 decades there was nearly no nationalistic party in Germany, because people had been really warned not to make this mistake again. Now it's changing a little bit, because there's also a gap which is left by this public opinion, which is dominated by certain medias, and they are saying that all kind of nationalistic populism is very dangerous, don't do that. And people feel a little bit annoyed of that, and they sometimes at the last elections in Germany were like that they voted, or a lot of Germans, a certain amount of Germans to be more precise, voted for the new national party which was founded recently. And it's also kind of protest against this from certain media's dominated public opinion. People are fed up a little bit of getting the sentiment, the feeling and the pressure to feel guilty. But I think you can say it works in a way, and if you really, let's say, would found a party which is which makes propaganda for anti-Semitism, for racism, and so on, it would be difficult in Germany, and it's also forbidden. So we have certain laws which are also helping to avoid that. In the case of communism, it's different. Everything is allowed. It's in certain circles also a little bit, let's say, fashionable to be left-wing and to read Karl Marx. There are circles reading this series about communism and so on, and it's cool to say like that. For example, in this street where I'm living, there's a restaurant which is called after Che Guevara, and I'm sure that they don't know anything about the role of Che Guevara and that he was responsible for murdering and so on. In the case of communism, the knowledge is very low, but we can see in our memory, we have a lot of young people, of young visitors, more than 200,000 high school students every year. Altogether, probably around 2 million went through this prison. took part in seminaries, and I often made the experience that they really learned something. Because, for example, if we are offering a new job, people are applying, and they are telling me, I was there 8 years ago. And I never forgot that experience, this guided tour with the former political prisoners through this very authentic prison. And it's really kind of immunization which worked, but you of course have to combine it with cognitive abilities. So it's not enough to be frightened about what happened in the past. You also must give information what was the reason, what was the ideology, and what is important to avoid such kind of systems. So you need a little bit more than only making people sensible for that. So I think there are some effects, but it's difficult also to prove and to so how can you measure that? Because there are always different reasons for your political opinion and your political knowledge. It's very difficult to connect it directly, education at school, let's say, and the opinion nowadays about the totalitarian regimes in the past.
Thank you. Luigi, in preparing this panel debate, I remember that you sent me an email in which you mentioned something about research on the effects of teaching about violent past on young people. Can you elaborate a bit on that? Can you agree with what colleague Knabe said, or do you say, well, in Italy we see different effects? Can you say something about that?
Actually, I think that this kind of empirical research is missing. In this sense, I totally agree with you. Politicians have the illusion, and since the middle of the 19th century, that they can use history, both outside and inside school, as a tool for creating a consensus, and thus implement their current agenda. In my opinion, this is not true. It's futile to create a narrative of the past with the idea of creating a consensus in the political agenda. Politicians create, for instance, curricula, they influence textbooks, they create museums like the museum we are going to visit this afternoon. But look at, for instance, at the French case. In France, they have since more or less 10 years this common French-German history textbook, and they have, of course, this positive narrative on the European past, which has been created since the 50s, above all by the Council of Europe. But I don't think that they are going to convince the voters of Marine Le Pen that Europe is a good thing. Actually, if we look at the attempts of the politicians to create this narrative, we have two different approaches. So we have the positive and the negative one. The positive one was, as I said, created by the Council of Europe, and they are still working on this field, above all in the newcomers, meaning the countries from the other side of the Iron Curtain. And they want to give a positive image of European past in order to convince people that it is good to live in Europe. Since the middle 80s, we have another narrative, meaning the narrative of the bad Europeans, the Europeans as perpetrators of crimes. In this sense, for instance, think at a model suggested by the German political scientist Leggevi, which is also quoted in one of the booklets we have seen on the desk outside. And he proposes a 7-step model of European memory, starting with the Holocaust, going through the massacre or genocide of the Armenians, going through the colonial crimes, and arriving to migration today. In my opinion, it is a bit difficult to create an allegiance to the in-group by telling the bad narrative of this in-group. It could work possibly in the Middle Ages when the heretics like Fra Dolcino could gather people saying, penitentia agite, do repent of your sins. But today, outside the religious context, it is a bit difficult. And to finish, yesterday, if I understood correctly, Professor Novak suggested us another, let's say, collective memory, the collective memory of victims of different crimes, as if all victims are the same, also their perception, regardless of the perpetrator. But in my opinion, we should stop, they should stop thinking about the use of the past because in my opinion, it doesn't work. But this is my modest opinion. As modest as the opinions of the others I listened to yesterday and in other contexts. I think I have some evidences for my opinion, but evidences are not a proof. And what is absolutely needed, in this sense, sociologists, if they want to be useful, could work, is what Karel said, meaning, let's make a serious sociological research in Europe, not like Eurobarometer, in order to understand how minds of people, different ages and different social status and so on, are influenced by certain forms of historical narrative inside and outside school.
Thank you.
I think that to start to answer this question, we need to analyze what the education is to check its effectiveness, because it's not only this master narrative itself. This master narrative is just a kind of framework for many other activities, for school curricula, museums, monuments, etc. A lot of facts we teach, etc. But in my opinion, there is also a third level, and the core of this concept of education about totalitarian systems. It's education about values, about justice, human rights, freedom, human dignity, etc. So if we ask a question about how to check effectiveness of education, it's and the answer also is divided. The first already said is possibility to use public opinions surveys to check if, for example, the knowledge about the totalitarian past is increasing or not, how the totalitarian past is judged by the society, etc. We can check it, and in Polish case, the knowledge, for example, is growing in many aspects, not all of them, and the level of condemnation, let's say, of especially communism also is increasing. The second possibility to check the situation is to observe various forms of commemorating activities, commemorating especially victims. If people want to attend in such ceremonies or not, are there new ideas how to commemorate? And so this is the second possible measure of this. And the third one is the hardest one, because how to check, in which way to check if there's values were internalized by youngsters, for example. I'm afraid that there are only a few possibilities to check it, and all of them are connected with critical situations. So we can check if people will oppose an attempt to implement another dictatorship. We can check how people behave during the large crisis like a war or something. So I do not wish any one of us this possibility to check. So we should stay in this aspect on the level of believing that our work has a sense, and at least a part of young people are accepting these values.
Thank you. So, in sum, we could say, if we look at the current situation of history education and on educating about totalitarian violence of the 20th century in different countries within Europe and the European Union, we come to a somewhat diffuse, even somewhat uncomfortable picture. As well, what we see is education approaches totalitarian violence mainly from a national perspective. If I understood you correctly, that's one thing. Secondly, well, we see there are interferences between collective memory, academic historiography, we see some critical narratives, we see some very nationalist narratives. We also hear that throughout the education in the different countries, in history education, it's not only about learning about the past, it's not only about historical education, but apparently also about moral education. And we hear that some people, young people, but adults as well, say, well, we are fed up with this moral guidance. We also have heard about misuses of the past. And then we see the effects of our history education. Let's say the picture there is rather mixed. If you would take political elections, the results of political elections as a measurement, well, you could say, whoa, this is not okay, because nationalist parties, right and extreme right parties, they rise all over Europe, so that's really a problem. On the other hand, yeah, well, we hear on the individual level, you said it, colleague Rabe, that a lot of people refer to a visit to the museum memorial, that they have memories about it. You also say, colleague Kaminski, we need to believe in what we do, and I agree, of course, but nevertheless, so this is rather a problematic preliminary conclusion, let's say, the state of history education as it is. So, but, well, let's say we deconstructed history educational practices up until the present, but what we also should think about, and this is what I also wanted to address in this panel debate, is, okay, how can we not only deconstruct current practices, but how can we construct new good practices? In your opinion, and you are all three specialists in the field of history education and or popular historical culture, how would you approach, in an educational way, the teaching of totalitarian violence in the 20th century? What would you, for instance, what would you use as a starting point? Academic historiography or popular culture? We heard in Italy, well, popular culture, you still have these movies that foster the idea of the good Italian students. On the other hand, you said, yeah, well, in Poland we have a lot of recent movies that really steer debate and that showed another perspective instead of the master narrative. A second question could be, what should we do in history education? Should we teach or should we preach? Is history education about historical education or about moral education? Open question for you to debate, of course. And then a third one, and that's equally important, and it connects to what we have heard about the rise of nationalist parties. In what way should we educate about totalitarian violence? Should we do that in a national way, or should we take a transnational perspective? And here immediately the idea of a European perspective pops up. Do you consider a common European memory necessary? Do you consider that desirable? Why? Why not should we do that? And if so, what should it contain? What should the main goal of this European memory be? So I raised a lot of questions. In order to steer some debate, I would like to hear the three of you, your opinions, and perhaps we can then ask people in the audience what they think, or they can react on what the participants said. I'm sorry for the probably difficult question, but this is why we're here. And so many. But you don't have to address every aspect. I just raised some questions, and I would like to hear certain ideas stemming from your experience within the field, of course.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to speak about two topics probably. The first question was about the methods of education. And of course we are confronted with the situation that this history we're talking about now is very far away for the young generation. And it's really difficult to catch them. And we are really obliged to develop new methods, especially in the area of the social medias, and of producing short videos. And for example, we just presented one, a 360-degree video where you, if you watch this video, you get a feeling that you are arrested by the Stasi and you are interrogated, and we hope that, and we said it through social medias, and it was shared of a lot of young people, and we are hoping that we come forward with these more contemporary methods of educating. Then, of course, there's still the classic way of education that you teach about history at school, but every one of us knows how effective it was at our school time when they were talking about the Roman Empire. Probably some of us were sleeping and not really interested in. So this is the second area which is still important. And the third one is that there are certain authentic sites which are, or we call them learning sites outside the school, something like that, außerschulische Lernorte. It's written now in our curriculums that school classes have to visit these places because the experience is that it's more effective than only looking in the textbook and hearing about history. And we have a lot of school classes traveling to Auschwitz, for example, or also to Hohenschönhausen and other sites. And I think it's really worth to do that. The second topic I wanted to talk about is what you mentioned at the beginning, this national perspective versus a European perspective. I think of our statements, we could hear already that the national perspective is the dominant perspective. And it's a problem, I think. I can understand why it is like that, but it's a problem. Not only because our societies are changing, especially in the western part of Europe. We have a lot of migrants, and it's not their national history anymore. And we are trying to develop methods of teaching also young migrants about what happened in the past in Germany, but it becomes much more difficult because they don't feel as Germans, and so they don't feel as perpetrators and so on. Of course, it's a big challenge, and therefore this is one reason why we have to develop a more than national perspective. And the other reason is that a national perspective can become very quickly a nationalistic perspective, as we saw that in the 90s, let's say in Croatia or in Serbia. And when I met Lucas the first time in New York, we were talking about the expulsion of the Germans in Poland, or in the former East German areas. And I was... there was a big debate about this information center which will be built up in Berlin in future. And Poland was very critical towards that. And I couldn't really understand this confrontation because the Polish people made a very similar experience of their own expulsion from the eastern part of Poland to the deportation to the western part of Poland. And so we share a lot of experiences, and it was my approach in this discussion in New York around 10 years ago or even more, to ask for a European perspective of coming to terms with this past. And I was also wondering, why don't we have in the European Union, we have a regulation of the form of the banana, for example, of olive oil in restaurants and so on, but we don't have any regulation about victims' compensation, which would be very useful to have a standard in every country how to compensate victims of these totalitarian regimes. We don't had and still have any common way of punishing the perpetrators, and so there are a lot of things to do on the European level, but it's still missing. The last point I wanted to mention why I think this European exchange is also very important, because as we saw here now, we have very different approaches. The Germans feel as perpetrators, you 50-50, and you as victims or heroes. And sometimes I'm thinking that I'm really appreciating the way how the two totalitarian regimes are aware in Poland. So they don't forget the communist time as it's done in Germany. But the danger of feeling as victims is that you can't probably really understand the mechanism, how that happened. You feel only as victims like a natural catastrophe which came over you, and you don't feel responsible, and you can reflect what probably should be done differently to avoid such a regime. And some months ago I was in Moscow and I visited the new Gulag Museum, and it was exactly this method. You hear about victims, it was very cruel in the past, but you don't hear any word about the perpetrators. And the structures which produced these victims, it's really like a tsunami, something like that. And then it was over, thankfully. But you don't reflect, which is really quite developed in Germany, the collaboration of ordinary people, that these people who were ruling Germany in the Nazi time, they were no devils, they were very normal people. We have a lot of studies. We have this information center in Berlin and the former headquarters of the Gestapo, where they are giving seminaries about the participation of the population to make these regimes possible. And this is, I think, is really very important, because if we want to avoid repetition of history, you must especially be aware of this mechanism that everybody of us could be a part of such a regime if certain conditions are given. So this perspective on the perpetrators, which is quite developed in Germany, I think it's also very important for other countries. If you feel only as a victim or as a hero, then it's a little bit comfortable. So you can sit back and say, yes, I was a victim, I was a hero, but you don't get the impulse, the motivation of reflecting what made these regimes possible.
Thank you. So I hear you say we should pay attention in history education in the future for new methods, ICT, movies and so on. Steer interest among young people. Leave schools. Take the outside school environment into schools. You talk about the European perspective, and indeed again you emphasized the importance of knowledge. We should not only preach, we should not only use the victim perspective, we should also lay bare the mechanisms behind totalitarian regimes, and therefore we need knowledge. I think these are four valuable paths for history education in the future. Luigi, what are your ideas about this?
Now, if you compare Italian history textbook with those of other European countries, you will see a greater stress on the European dimension than on the national one. And in this context, the totalitarian violence, the everyday violence, is the only one which is dealt with, above all in the Italian, German, and Soviet cases. What is missing is an explanation of other forms of violence, above all in war. So it's totally missing an anthropological approach to violence in war, which, on the contrary, is very much present outside school, in the media, and so on. Somebody says that there is a specific fascist character in Nazi and Italian fascist violence during the Second World War, but the Japanese case is totally ignored. So in my opinion, it would be necessary in the future to include, because it is one of the most relevant issues in the common debate, to include tools for understanding the dynamics of violence in war, and from all sides, not only from the sides of the well-known perpetrators, not only the Axis powers perpetrated violences during the Second World War, but the same is true for the First World War. There we start seeing a greater attention to the experience of the victims. Also in this sense, we can't compare, we have seen that very clearly yesterday in Professor North's speech. It is impossible to compare the experience, the today understanding of the First World War in Western and Eastern Europe. Once until, let's say, the 60s, 70s, you can still find in the master narratives heroes of the First World War. Today, heroes have totally disappeared, and we only speak about soldiers and victims in Western Europe. But on the other side, the First World War was the moment of national liberation. For them it is something positive, but for other countries it is, on the contrary, only a tragedy. And an horizontal tragedy involving both parts in war. So for the presentation of violence, which in my opinion is still a big problem in history education. Concerning teaching or preaching, well, of course, preaching makes no sense. It is also, in my opinion, unacceptable, and in most cases, counterproductive. A common European memory cannot exist by definition, because memory is the outcome of experiences. What can exist is a common European narrative, can be invented and imposed from above. Scientifically speaking, it is nonsense. Politically speaking, but I would like to mention another very recent case which could connect representations of history and the outcome of political elections. You all know about Brexit. In the year before Brexit, a group of very prominent British historians created an association, Historians for Britain, and they produced the text, they wrote articles in newspapers and so on, saying the United Kingdom has a special history different from the rest of the continent, so we must either leave the European Union or deeply renegotiate this form of belonging. Immediately, another group of very prominent historians, British historians, wrote a manifesto saying exactly the opposite. British history is part of the European continental history, so we must tighten our relation with the European Union. Do you think that these groups of historians, very prominent, very well represented in the media and so on, had any influence in the outcome of the referendum? I don't think so.
Thank you. Before you can proceed, debates among historians are indeed rather vivid. In France, we have the debate going on about the book on world history of France, in which a large group of historians, some 120 historians, they have produced a book with all kinds of different contributions on external influences on French history and on French society. And so this is vividly debated because some other historians, they say, yeah, well, what you are now doing, you are undermining French identity. We are the greatest country in the world. And now you are saying that our greatness apparently stems from the outside world. So what you said about national perspectives, national memory cultures, in relation to the Brexit, for instance, you see it among Europe everywhere. So this tension between a national and transnational approach is really a very vivid and a really important one. But I just wanted to mention that. Please, Lucas, your thoughts, please, on the issue.
So firstly, I cannot agree with this image of a dangerous situation in which this totalitarian past is described only from the national perspective. And of course, this framework is created from the national perspective and as we saw, different in every respective country. But if we speak about this core, according to the model I proposed, which are values are universal. So I think there is a lot of possibilities to use it in many contexts, even to understand each other. Because if we can understand, for example, our victims, we are able to understand other nation victims, yes? Because this fate of victims is similar. And speaking about this ideal model of education, I completely agree with Hubertus that we are obliged to look almost every day or every week for new methods, new techniques to contact, to educate young people. But I think there are some general rules, and basing on my experience, there are 5 general rules in education about the totalitarian past. It applies to this specific part of our history. So, of course, our education has to be based on truth. So, this is a need of good research we can use in our education. The second, divided into 2, this education should be personal. First, we should, in my opinion, of course, not to speak just general about the thousands, hundreds of thousands or millions of victims, but show the personal cases. And there is a possibility to show also the cases of perpetrators. It's not only about the victims. We can show various choices from the past, and this education should be personal in the sense that it should touch the concrete human being. So we shouldn't address just to the youth of Poland. We should try to use maybe emotions. Of course, there is a strong debate. Is it right to use emotions in education? But we should address our education to the concrete people, young people. And this education should be engaging. So we should show that it's not only about the knowledge, not only about compassion, which is of course very important, but this kind of experience should push you to do something in contemporary reality, to commemorate or to be engaged in some current issues, etc. And the last one, in my opinion, the best education about totalitarian system is education in situ. So in the places like former camps, prisons, other places. And here there is a problem, because we fortunately protect a lot of such places from the Second World War era. But if you are speaking about the post-war communist experience, of course, there are differences. Quite good situation in Germany, but for example, in Poland, majority of these places is not protected. So, how to educate in 100 or 200 years without such a places? So, it's I think very, very important to preserve places and move the education from the schools to these places.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. I hear both of you stressing the need to also indeed teach in situ, to include heritage in all kinds of ways and fashions in education. One could ask himself, these heritage sites that you are talking about, are these national ones, or would they precisely provide an opportunity to look at them in a European perspective? Could they contribute to, if that's desirable, first of all, to a European perspective? Could they contribute to what Luigi said about, well, perhaps we could construct a common narrative in Europe? It's just a small question. You don't have to answer if you don't want, because we only... But you...
Short answer. I think such a form of education is rather in general human one than European or Asian or American one. So I think this is accessible for every human being. And the second point, the question about the common European narrative on history, this question was already asked during the first seminar in Gdańsk, if I remember well, in 2012, and I didn't change my mind in this aspect. I think it is not possible to prepare some general view of European history and base on it some European identity. Of course, we can have elements, so we can choose from the past some common events or such things like totalitarian experience, which is, I think, more or less common European experience. We can use our Roman, Egypt, Christian roots, etc. But those are only some elements. I don't believe in any kind of common European narrative about the history. Maybe I will change my mind this afternoon after seeing the House of European History.
Who knows? I will just let Hubertus respond very quickly, and then we still have some less than 10 minutes for the audience to ask questions, because we have heard from the three participants many interesting things, many interesting paths for the future, many thought-provoking things, so I can imagine that many of you have questions, and then the opportunity is there to ask them. But Hubertus, if you could quickly comment.
Very briefly, I would like to add one more aspect to your question, because I think it's a problem of methodology of these authentic sites. You have to start with the site and what happened there. If you try to generalize a site, then you destroy the big impression which can be caused by such a site. You are standing in a cell. You know that this person was arrested here. You are standing in a camp and you hear the story of somebody who had been killed in this camp. This is a really very important approach, and if you try to generalize that, then you destroy this very, let's say, effective way of sensibilizing people for history.
Thank you. So now we have some minutes left for people in the audience who would like to ask a question. We don't have that much time, so if you could... So if you could make it brief, that would be good.
Bogdanovic, the level of maturity and democratic legitimation of an individual and a society has to do with the ability to introspect. Professor Knabe said something about Germany. We have the German very good example of Vergangenheitsbewältigung. On the other end of the scope, we have countries like Serbia and Croatia being citizens of a citizen of both. I am entitled to be very critical to both their practices in that respect. It's just not what they did to us. It's what we did to them. In that respect, both Serbia and Croatia have a very, very poor record. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. More questions?
Just a short remark also. Thank you very much to all of you for your opinions. To Dr. Knabe, I was thinking when you were saying about the education and the way how to teach for refugees, for example, about the past, which was not their past. I think it immediately brings us to the present, and for many of them who, for example, come from Syria, the problem how to talk about the Holocaust in the context of Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Israeli politics and policy in the Middle East in general. So I don't know what can be the decision, but I was thinking that maybe it can be fruitful, for example, to bring the representative of Israeli civic society to have a discussion or involve them somehow in this education process. That's it. Thank you.
So it's a question about relation between past, present, historical analogies to the present. Do you wish to say something about this?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. It's really a problem that a lot of migrants are more or less openly anti-Semitist. And so there's really a change in schools. For example, if they are visiting a concentration camp, a former concentration camp, then you have nowadays young people who are provocating there and who are making jokes and who are even saying that Hitler should have killed more Jews than he was able to kill. It's really a big problem, and we must find, we can't avoid this discussion. We must discuss with these young people, and there's, I think the thing Lucas mentioned is probably the most effective one. If you speak about an individual person and the experiences of this person, then you can make people sensible for human values, and nobody wants to end in a concentration camp or in a prison, and with this way probably you can also give this general perspective. And there are also some special links between, let's say, the situation in Syria, because it was dominated, or it was an ally of the Soviet Union and now of Russia, and you have a secret police which is very strong, which is torturing people, and you can, of course, develop special programs which stress this link between the past, the secret police in Germany of the Nazi time or of the communist time, and the secret police in Syria. And then probably you can catch these young migrants, but it's a big challenge for all of us.
Thank you, and most certainly. I saw two more people raising their heads, perhaps.
Thank you. Giles Bennett, Institute for Contemporary History. Coming back to education in Germany briefly, how can we improve education on the Nazi period if some people are coming away feeling as that they have to feel as perpetrators, when I would argue they should rather feel responsibility for what happened in the past, but of course they are not perpetrators of things that happened before their birth or even their adulthood. And conversely, how can we perhaps communicate more also in West Germany the successful East German revolution and liberation, which happened, of course, under the right global circumstances, but which has been the first successful and in most ways positive revolution in German history, at least for a long time.
Thank you. If you could very briefly comment, because we...
It's difficult to answer briefly. So, feeling responsible for something you didn't do, it's difficult. And I think it will become more and more difficult as far as the history is gone. And perhaps there's a danger if you press somebody to feel responsible for something where he's not responsible for. that you can cause kind of anti-reactions. So it's probably better to explain what happened and to try to let young people understand why it happened. And history is very interesting and also fascinating if you are speaking about individual experiences. And it's probably enough. I don't know how our neighbors will think about if the Germans don't feel responsible anymore for the Nazi time. But there's really the danger of this some anti-reaction in the very young generation, because it's now 70 years ago, so it's like World War I, and I don't know if anybody of us feel responsible for World War I. Probably not, and it will be the same situation in future, I think, also for the Nazi time and Germany. So we must probably develop new approaches which are not stressing so much the responsibility of the Germans, but more the explanation of what happened in the past. The second point is really very important for me as well, the peaceful revolution in 1989, and it's not the only revolution which should be more in the focus of the public opinion. Also the uprising in 1953 in East Germany, which was really a very a kind of revolution for free elections and democracy, and which was ended by the Soviet tanks in 1953. The Germans have, in a way, difficulties to focus on these positive events in history. It's probably caused by this focusing on the Nazi time and the fact of being responsible for that, that they are a little bit afraid to stress these democratic events. And I'm regretting very much that the peaceful revolution is handled so nearby, so like it's not very important. We don't have any street which is named after the peaceful revolution in Germany. So it's strange. But we have hundreds of street names in East Germany about Karl Marx, Karl Liebknecht, Rosa Luxemburg, Ernst Thälmann, even Otto Grote was the prime minister of GDR. I think 70 streets we still have in Germany. So there's a big difference between the commemoration of the peaceful revolution and the commemoration and street names of former communist functionaries or theorists. And so I really would like to develop this commemoration about these positive events in German history. But it's difficult. We also don't commemorate a lot about the revolution in 1848, the first democratic parliament in Frankfurt. It doesn't play a big role in our historical education. We are very focused on this Nazi time. There are certain attempts to change that, but they are not very effective. But I would completely agree with you that it's good to show that you can change these regimes. And our generation has experienced it was possible to change or to end this regime, what nearly nobody hoped, or even not nobody was thinking about that this was possible, but it was possible, and this can be a big motivation of being politically active and not to resign, but to think it's possible even to destroy such an armed regime like it existed in East Germany with a secret police of nearly 100,000 employees, nearly 200,000 spies and informers. It was possible, and it could motivate people to take this experience for their political life nowadays.
Thank you. This is a very interesting and same concluding remark about the position of agency in history education. Agency is about the role humans, Not only great men like in the 19th century, but ordinary men can play or not play in history. In Northern American history education, there's a lot of debate going on the role of agency in history and on should we stress agency, should we stress the role of regular, ordinary human beings in changing the course of history. So this is also something we could think about in history education for the future. Unfortunately, since we do not want to delay the program of the conference too much, we are going to have to end the panel debate here. I would like to thank the three participants for their most interesting contribution to the panel. I also would like you, the audience, to thank you for listening and for asking questions and giving remarks. And I'm sure we can continue the debate over the short coffee break. Thank you very much.